They packed his things on a Saturday morning. Not carefully. Not with the kind of attention you give to the belongings of someone you love. Quickly, efficiently. The way you pack things when you want the task to be finished. His clothes went into 2 black bin bags. Not suitcases. Bin bags. The same kind you use for rubbish. His books, the ones he had collected over 60 years, were put in cardboard boxes, without any particular care for which way they faced, or whether the spines would survive the handling. His photographs, the ones from his wedding, the ones of his children as babies, the ones from holidays and Christmases and ordinary Sundays that had somehow become precious, were wrapped loosely in newspaper and placed on top of the boxes. His armchair, the one he had sat in every evening for 22 years, was left behind, because there was no room for it where he was going. Where he was going was a care home on the edge of town, not the good one, the affordable one, the one that smelled of institutional cleaning fluid and served dinner at 5 o'clock. Harold Briggs was 83 years old. He had raised 3 children in the house he was now being removed from. He had paid the mortgage on it for 31 years. He had handed it to his son at no cost, when he could no longer manage it alone. And now, on a Saturday morning in November, his son was putting his belongings in bin bags, and 3 days later, a phone rang, and everything changed. Before I tell you what happened when that phone rang, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. Have you ever watched someone treat an elderly person, a parent, a grandparent, someone's mother or father, in a way that made you feel ashamed on behalf of the human race? Have you ever witnessed someone being discarded, not dramatically, but quietly, efficiently, without ceremony, simply because they were no longer convenient? Drop a single word in the comments below, yes or no. Because this story is about what happens when the people who are supposed to show up don't, and about what the universe sometimes does in response. Now let me tell you about Harold, and about the family that threw him out, and about the phone call that came 3 days later. Harold Briggs was born in 1941, the second of 5 children. His father worked in a factory. His mother worked in the home, which in those years was not considered work by anyone except the people who did it. Harold left school at 15, got a job, gave money to his mother every Friday from his first wage packet. That was simply what you did. That was the world he came from. He met Patricia when he was 22. She was 20. She had dark hair and a laugh that arrived before she did in any room. He proposed 6 months after they met, not because it was quick, because he was certain. He had never been uncertain about Patricia. Not for a single day in the 47 years they were married. They built a life together, the way people of their generation built lives, steadily, without drama, without the expectation that it should feel extraordinary every day. They had 3 children, Robert first, then Susan, then David, the youngest, who arrived 7 years after Susan, and who had the particular quality of a child who knows they were the surprise and has decided to be worth it. Harold worked in engineering for 38 years. The same company, the same building. He was reliable, precise, unspectacular in the way that only becomes spectacular when you measure it against time. He coached Robert's football team on Saturday mornings for 6 years. He helped Susan with her mathematics every evening until she understood it, which took longer than either of them expected, and which neither of them ever mentioned to anyone else. He taught David to drive, an experience that David described at Harold's 80th birthday as the 3 weeks most likely to have ended both our lives. Harold laughed harder than anyone at that. He had a laugh that arrived quietly and built slowly, the opposite of Patricia's, but just as real. Patricia died when Harold was 76. After 54 years together, she went quickly, which was both a mercy and a cruelty, and left Harold in a house that was suddenly twice as large and half as warm. He managed. That was what Harold did. He managed. He cooked for himself, cleaned for himself, kept the garden in the condition Patricia had always maintained. He visited his children when invited. He did not impose. That was important to him. He did not want to be the kind of father who became a burden. He had watched other men his age do that, lean into their children's lives in ways that were not asked for. And he had decided quietly and firmly that he would not. He would be available. He would be present when wanted. He would not become a weight. For 5 years after Patricia died, he managed. Until the winter, he was 81. When managing became harder, it started with a fall. Not a serious one. He caught himself on the kitchen counter, bruised his hip, was sore for 2 weeks, did not tell his children immediately. When he did tell them, because Robert noticed he was moving differently on a Sunday visit, the response was immediate, a family meeting, the 3 of them, without Harold initially. Robert, Susan, and David sat in Robert's kitchen and discussed what to do about their father. Harold found out about the meeting afterward. He found out because David, who was the youngest and the most honest, and the one Harold had always suspected, felt things more deeply than the other two, told him. The conclusion of the meeting was that Harold should not be living alone, which was not unreasonable. The conclusion was also that Harold should move in with one of them, which seemed generous, until the details emerged. Robert had a large house, 4 bedrooms, 2 of which were empty since his children had left home. He offered the smaller of the 2. Temporarily, he said, until they sorted something more permanent. Harold moved in with Robert and his wife Sandra in March. He brought what he needed. He left the rest. He was careful to be unobtrusive. He ate what he was given. He kept his room tidy. He did not use the television in the main sitting room during the hours he sensed Robert and Sandra preferred to use it. He found the library 2 streets away and went there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He found a bench in the park nearby and sat there when the weather permitted. He tried, with great and quiet effort, not to be a weight. Robert's resentment arrived gradually. That is the honest way to describe it. It did not begin as cruelty. It began as inconvenience. The small adjustments that living with an elderly parent requires. The bathroom taking longer in the mornings. The slight change in the rhythm of the house. The occasional need to factor Harold into plans. Small things. The kind of things that most people absorb without difficulty. But Robert was a man who valued his routines. His house the way he liked it. His evenings the way he had structured them. Sandra, his wife, was less patient than she had initially appeared. Harold noticed this within the first month. The slight tension when he stayed in the kitchen too long. The way conversations paused when he entered a room and resumed differently after. The quality of welcome that gradually, degree by degree, thinned. He mentioned none of this to Susan or David. He did not want to cause problems. He did not want to be the reason his children argued. He ate quietly, moved quietly, existed as quietly as a man can exist. It was not enough. By the 5th month, Robert had begun making comments, small ones at first, about space, about the cost of heating, about how long Harold's doctor appointments were taking, which required Robert to adjust his own schedule to provide transport. Harold listened to these comments. He said very little. He was 82 years old. He had raised 3 children. He had worked for 38 years. He had loved the same woman for 54 years. He had managed alone for 5 years after losing her. And he sat in his son's house, in the smaller of the 2 empty bedrooms, and listened to comments about the cost of heating. He called Susan once, carefully, not to complain, just to ask, in the most indirect way he could manage, whether she thought things were all right. Susan said she was sure it was fine. Susan said Robert was probably just stressed with work. Susan said Harold should try not to read too much into things. He thanked her. He said she was probably right. He did not call her again. David visited once. He sat with Harold in his room for an hour. He asked how things really were. Harold said, "I'm managing." David looked at him for a moment. He said, "Dad, how are things really?" Harold looked at his youngest son. He saw the concern there, the genuine kind. He said, "I think I might need to look at other options." David said he would speak to Robert. 3 days after David spoke to Robert, the bin bags appeared. It was a Saturday. Harold woke at his usual time, 6:45, the habit of a working life that never fully left him. He dressed. He went to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of tea, carefully, quietly, as he always did, and he sat at the kitchen table. Robert came downstairs at 8. He sat across from Harold. He did not make himself a cup of tea. He placed both hands on the table. He said, "Dad, we need to talk about the arrangement." Harold looked at his son. He said, "All right." Robert talked for 11 minutes. Harold counted. Not deliberately, but afterward he found he could account for every one of them. Robert talked about the pressure, about Sandra's feelings, about the impact on their routine, about a care home he had found, about how it was actually very good, about how Harold would have his own room, about how there were activities, about how it would be better for everyone. Harold sat with both hands around his teacup. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He did not cry, which surprised him slightly, because he had thought he might. He said, "When are you thinking?" Robert said, "We thought today, actually. Sandra has already spoken to them. They have a room available." Harold looked at his son. He said, "Today," Robert said. "It's better to do these things quickly. Less time to sit and worry about it." Harold looked at his hands. He thought about Patricia, about what she would say in this moment. He thought she would probably say something that would make Robert feel very small indeed, but Patricia was not here. So Harold said, "All right, give me an hour to pack." Robert said, "I've already started. Your things are mostly in the bags." Harold was quiet for a very long time. Then he stood. He washed his cup. He dried it. He put it back in the cupboard, and he went upstairs to see what had been packed in the bin bags that had been prepared for him without his knowledge, on a Saturday morning, by his son. The care home was called Meadowview. There were no meadows visible from any window. There was a car park, and beyond that a retail park, and beyond that a gray November sky. Harold's room was on the second floor. It was clean. It was adequate. It had a single bed and a wardrobe and a chair by the window that was not his chair. A television on the wall he had not asked for. A call button beside the bed. Robert carried the boxes and the bin bags up in 2 trips. He was efficient. He set things down. He looked around the room. He said, "It's actually quite nice, isn't it?" Harold said, "Yes." Robert said he would visit at the weekend. He said Sandra sent her best. He said Harold should settle in and not worry about anything. He said the staff seemed very good. He said all the things people say in those moments. Harold listened to all of them. He shook his son's hand at the door. Robert seemed surprised by the handshake. Harold was not sure why. It seemed appropriate. Robert left. Harold sat in the chair by the window that was not his chair. He looked at the car park. He sat there for a long time. A care assistant knocked and brought him tea at 5:30. She was young, perhaps 19. She asked his name. He told her. She said, "Nice to meet you, Harold. I'm Chloe. You just press the button if you need anything." He said thank you. She left. He drank the tea. He sat in the chair that was not his chair, and he looked at the car park, and the retail park, and the gray November sky. And he thought about the 83 years that had brought him to this room, this adequate room, with its adequate chair, and its view of a car park. And he thought, not with bitterness, but with the particular clarity that comes to people when they have nothing left to pretend, that this was not how he had imagined it would end. The first day Harold mostly sat. He arranged his photographs on the windowsill, his wedding picture, his children as babies, the holiday in Tenerife that Patricia had insisted on, and that he had initially resisted, and that had turned out to be one of the best 2 weeks of his life. He put his books on the small shelf above the desk. There were not enough shelves for all of them. He stacked the rest carefully on the floor beside the wardrobe. The care assistant Chloe brought him his meals. She remembered his name each time. He appreciated that more than she knew. He slept poorly the first night. The sounds of the building were unfamiliar, the particular silence of a place where many people are alone in adjacent rooms. The second day he found the common room, sat in it for an hour, watched three other residents watching a television program he did not recognize, exchanged a few words with a man called Arthur who had been there for 2 years, and who spoke with the authority of someone who has learned the geography of a new country. Arthur told him the food was better on Thursdays, that the afternoon tea was always worth attending, that the young staff were kinder than the older ones generally, which Arthur found counterintuitive, but had come to accept as simply true. Harold listened. He thanked Arthur. He went back to his room. The third day he woke early, 6:45. He dressed. He sat in the chair by the window. He watched the car park fill up slowly as the morning arrived. He thought about Patricia. He thought about the garden she had kept, about the kitchen table where they had eaten every meal for 30 years, about the armchair he had left behind because there was no room for it where he was going. He was thinking about the armchair when the phone rang. It was the mobile phone David had insisted on buying him 3 years ago. Harold had resisted at the time. He was glad of it now. He looked at the screen. A number he did not recognize. He answered. A woman's voice. Professional. Precise. She gave her name. She said she was a solicitor. She said she was calling on behalf of the estate of a Mr. George Whitmore. Harold was quiet for a moment. He said, George. The solicitor said, You knew Mr. Whitmore. Harold said, We were friends for 60 years. He paused. He died? The solicitor said George Whitmore had passed away 11 days ago. Harold sat very still in his chair. He had known George since they were young men, since the factory, since the years before Patricia, since the years when everything was still ahead of them, and neither of them knew yet what kind of men they would become. George had never married. He had told Harold once, sitting in Harold's kitchen on a Tuesday evening 30 years ago, that he had been too busy becoming himself to find time to become half of someone else. He had said it without regret. George was the kind of man who meant what he said. He had done well for himself, quietly, without announcement, property mostly. A business he had built over 40 years, and sold at 68, for a sum he mentioned to Harold only once, and in the same tone he might use to mention the weather. Harold had visited him every month for 60 years. Even after Patricia died, even when travel was harder, even when the visits became shorter because George tired more quickly, even in the last year when George was in a home not unlike this one, and Harold would sit beside his chair, and they would not always talk, because sometimes talking is not the point. He had visited George 12 days before being put in bin bags and brought here. He had not known it was the last time. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. The solicitor waited. She was patient. He appreciated that. He said, What can I do for you? The solicitor said, Mr. Whitmore left specific instructions regarding his estate. He was very clear about what he wanted, and he was very clear about you. Harold looked out of the window at the car park, at the retail park beyond it, at the gray November sky. He said, What do you mean? The solicitor said, Mr. Whitmore has left you the majority of his estate, Mr. Briggs. Harold said nothing. He left a letter as well. He asked that I read it to you. Shall I do that now? Harold said, Yes, please. The solicitor read, Harold, if you are hearing this, then I have gone before you, which means you won the argument we have been having for 30 years about which one of us would go first. I concede the point. Harold made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. The solicitor continued, I have been trying to decide what to leave you for 20 years. Every time I updated this document, I changed my mind. Not about leaving things to you. About whether what I was leaving was the right thing. You always had everything you needed. A home. A family. Patricia, I used to think there was nothing I could give you that you didn't already have. But then Patricia died, and I watched you manage, the way you always manage. Quietly, without asking for anything, without letting anyone see the effort behind it. And I thought, that is Harold. That has always been Harold, the man who carries things without showing you the weight. I watched your children. I watched what they gave you and what they didn't. I said nothing, because it was not my place. But I noticed. I have always noticed. You were a better father than they deserved. I say that not to cause pain. I say it because it is true, and because I am dead, and therefore past the point of worrying about whether truth is comfortable. Harold's hand was very tight around the phone. The solicitor continued. I am leaving you the house on Caldwell Street, the one I bought in 1987, and that you told me I was making a mistake buying. You were wrong about that, as it turned out. It is worth considerably more than what I paid for it. I am leaving you the investment accounts. The total value of the estate I am leaving to you is approximately £1.4 million. Before you say anything, and I know you are about to say something, I have no children. I have no one who needs this. I have distant relatives I have never met, and have no obligation to. And I have you, the only person who visited me every month for 60 years. The only person who sat beside my chair in that room and did not need me to perform being fine. The only person who understood that sometimes sitting together is enough. You gave me 60 years of that. This is what I have to give in return. Use it well. Live somewhere that has room for your armchair. That is not a suggestion. It is a condition. Your friend, George. The solicitor stopped reading. The room was quiet. Harold sat in the chair by the window. The car park below. The retail park beyond. The gray November sky. He was quiet for so long that the solicitor gently said his name. He said, I'm here. He said, he knew about the armchair. The solicitor said, I'm sorry? Harold said, nothing. I'm sorry. He was a good man. The solicitor said, the letter suggests he thought the same of you. Harold called David that afternoon. He told him about the call, about the letter, about the house on Caldwell Street, about £1.4 million. David was silent for a long time, and then he said, Dad, and Harold said, I know. David came to see him the following day. He sat with Harold in his room. He looked at the bin bags that were still not fully unpacked, at the books stacked on the floor because there were not enough shelves, at the chair by the window that was not Harold's chair. He said, I'm sorry, Dad. Harold looked at his youngest son. He said, I know you are. He said, I need you to help me find somewhere to live, somewhere with room for my armchair. David said, yes. He said it without hesitation. Robert called 3 days after David. His tone was different from the last time they had spoken. Harold noticed this. He said very little. He listened. He said, thank you for calling, Robert. He said, I'll let you know how I get on. He did not say more than that. Susan called the same evening. Harold was equally polite, equally brief, equally unrevealing. He did not perform bitterness. He did not perform forgiveness either. He simply answered the calls and let the silence between the words say what needed to be said. 6 weeks after the phone call from the solicitor, Harold moved into a house. Not the house on Caldwell Street. That was being handled separately. A rented house first. Small, well-maintained. A garden that needed attention. A sitting room with enough space. And in the corner of that sitting room, his armchair, collected from Robert's house by David on a Tuesday afternoon. Harold sat in it that first evening. He made himself a cup of tea. He looked at the photographs he had arranged on the mantelpiece. Patricia, the children as babies, Tenerife, and one new one. Him and George, 30 years old, standing outside the factory where they had met. Both of them squinting against the sun. Both of them with no idea yet of what their lives would become. He sat in his armchair. He drank his tea, and for the first time since the Saturday morning with the bin bags, he felt like himself. I have thought about Harold and George for a long time since I heard this story, and here is what stays with me. George did not leave Harold his estate because Harold needed the money. At the time of the phone call, Harold needed many things, but money was perhaps not the most important of them. George left it because he had watched. For 60 years he had paid attention. He had noticed what Harold gave, and what Harold was given in return. He had seen the quality of Harold's love for his family, and the quality of the return on that love, and he had done the thing that the people closest to Harold had forgotten to do. He had seen him fully, without the filter of convenience or obligation, or the complicated emotional arithmetic that families sometimes apply to their parents. Just seen him, and named what he saw, in the most permanent way available to him. The lesson here is not about inheritance. It is not about getting what you deserve. It is not even about justice, though there is justice in this story. It is about presence. The 60 years of monthly visits, the Tuesday evenings in Harold's kitchen, the sitting beside the chair in the room at the end. When talking was no longer always necessary, George gave Harold his estate. But Harold had been giving George something for 60 years that is worth considerably more than £1.4 million. He had been showing up, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, without expecting anything, without calculating the return, simply because George was his friend. And that was what you did for people who were your friends. The people who love us without agenda, who show up without calculation, who sit beside us when sitting is enough, are the most valuable people in any life. And we do not always recognize that until we are sitting in a chair by a window, looking at a car park, when a phone rings. If you have a Harold in your life, an elderly parent or grandparent or someone who is aging quietly and asking for nothing, check on them today. Not because of what they might leave you, not because of any calculation at all, because they are there, because they are asking for nothing, because the ones who ask for the least often need the most. And if you have a George, someone who has been there quietly for years, someone who shows up without announcement, someone who sits beside you when talking is not necessary, tell them today what they mean to you, not later, today. Because George never heard Harold say it out loud. Harold never heard George say it out loud. They were men of a generation that did not always find those words easily. But they both knew. They both knew. And knowing, without saying, is sometimes enough. But saying it is always better. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have a grandparent or elderly parent who you have not called this week, put down whatever you are doing after this video ends, and call them. Right now, before another week passes, subscribe to The Untold Cost for a new story every week. Stories about the people we overlook, the love we forget to name, and the phone calls that change everything. I will see you in the next one.